This training is going to be covering how to troubleshoot invoice rejections. Now, there are 3 specific ways that invoices are rejected. One way is by an out-of-the-box CSM rule. The second way is a custom rule written by the client for their environment. And a third way is just a manual rejection done by hand that a human being on the client side is typing out for the vendor. And we'll look at what those look like. First, let's cover the out-of-the-box rules. There is an article on the Client Success Center called "What are the Invoice Validation Out-of-the-Box Rules and What are the Messages of Rejection?" So here you can peruse through this list on your own to see the exact type of rule that it is, what its action is, which is a warning message or rejection reason. And this is a pretty long list, but there's other validations as well that you can also review on your own. But this list is inclusive, it's all-encompassing of all the rules that are out there. So once you understand what those out-of-the-box rules are, you can help identify with a client if their invoice rule is actually a custom rule or an out-of-the-box rule. If an out-of-the-box rule is misbehaving and isn't functioning as we would like it to function, then that would be a defect. But if it isn't, then the client can either turn that rule off or make a copy and make adjustments to that rule as needed. These are some of the rules that are available in this under the invoice object. This is one of the out-of-the-box rules here, timekeeper billed too much time. And I know that because on the actual list here, there is a timekeeper billed too much time. And it actually provides a warning, timekeeper daily time entry exceeds maximum allowed hours. And we can see what that looks like on the actual invoice here. And this invoice, you can see that there's a warning, timekeeper daily entry exceeds the maximum hours of 8 hours. The units here is the hours that was submitted, which is 9. Obviously, there's not 9 hours that someone should be working on a day-to-day, so we have that rule in place for this reason. And line item warnings, there's 1 on here because there's 1 line item, but that's that warning for you. Another rule is if the invoice charges are too old. As that rule is active, the action here is to run a class file, and it marks that the maximum number of days between the charge date and invoice date is 180 days. And that's a warning message. So if you go to the invoice, we have this example here for you. This invoice states that the charge, service, or expense is more than 205 days, and the maximum allowed is 180 days. The date here is for November 9th. Today is May 30th, so of course this is way too old to be submitting. So what we did here was we went ahead and rejected this invoice, and there was a comment put on here, date of line item is too old, you cannot submit an invoice with line item older than 180 days. This was manually typed in. So we can see what that looks like by pretending to reject this invoice, the one that has too many hours. Once you hit reject, you can put a comment to the requester. That's going to actually show up on the invoice in Collaborati for the vendor, and you can confirm that rejection. So what we saw was this invoice here, invoice 3. It was marked as rejected, and this is that comment that I manually typed in. You can't submit an invoice with line item older than 180 days. This is what that rejection looks like inside Collaborati. This is what it looks like inside Team Connect. And this is how you do it inside Team Connect, is by hitting that reject button. So once you have all of that, what you should understand is that you're actually going to be able to see that rule in these action items inside of the CSM logs. In order to find it, you're going to go find those error messages in the logs. You're going to go to the logs, of course. So let's view the CSM logs. And I'm going to find invoice synchronization. So in the CSM sync, there are specific steps of synchronizations, and they are done in a specific order, but you can always be guaranteed, as long as the sync does not stop or it doesn't crash or break, that you're going to see the section inside each and every one of those sync cycles. So we're gonna look at this one. This one, there wasn't any invoices at that time. So let's just go down a few invoice syncs to see if we can find the error message. Let's keep going here. There's still no invoices, no invoice. All right, there's one invoice here. This one invoice, as you can see, is the invoice for, it just states that there is a pending invoice. This is the ID for that invoice. Okay. Another section of invoice sync here, you can see that there's this, you can see the actual invoice number itself. This is processing the invoice 98765 training test 2. This is that second invoice we didn't get a chance to look at, but let's find the other. Here it is. This is invoice number 1. And what it's telling me here, it has one line item. This is the primary key for that invoice. And that primary key you can find by going to the invoice itself, going to the share button, and looking at the last couple of digits there after the invoice object. And you can see that there was a token created, that is received. You can also see that there was a rule that started. So it started this rule: timekeeper billed too much time. Max hours is 8, but we had put in 9. So that's where this rule came in, and that's why it got flagged. Once it was flagged, you can see it here in the logs. It specifically calls out the name of that rule for you, and you can see it in the actual Team Connect itself as well. Now there is this other invoice, invoice 3, and this also had a rule run, which is that billed too much time item. And that's it. Okay, let's forget about that last piece about invoice line because I already said it. Anyway. So from the invoice synchronization, you can see that the rules are called out as long as they're being triggered, and in the background, if the qualifications aren't met, then the rule's not going to show up. It just goes through. So that's how you find those rules in the logs. There's these 3 ways for that it can be rejected. You have seen how it looks like inside Collaborati. Another thing that you can take a look at is the actual email rejection. If a vendor is set up for notifications inside Collaborati, they will also get this email notification with the rejected comment on there as well. So this is kind of a summary of that rejection. They can also go straight to Collaborati and see the same rejection on the invoice itself. We also have another example here. It says, kindly resubmit the invoice with the correct legal entity. This sounds more like a warning, and it was rejected probably manually by the client themselves, and they typed this out. Another one we can look at is this case here. There was an actual rejection for an invoice, and that rejection here is pretty lengthy. This looks like it would be a custom rule written specifically for this client, as it calls out a specific line item and it says, please contact the client if you have any questions. So you've seen how to find the logs, how to identify rules in the logs. You've also seen what warnings look like, what rejections look like, and now you know that there are only 3 ways an invoice will be rejected. 1, by an out-of-the-box rule, which we have listed out for you. 2, by a client's rule, which is a custom rule, and we can see from here a couple of the examples. You can find those rejections as well. And they're going to be specific to each client, so they're going to be really unique. But the best thing to do is find that rule in the logs and help the client and vendor understand why that invoice was rejected. And either the rule needs to be adjusted or the invoice needs to be adjusted in order for that invoice to get approved. And thirdly, it's just a manual rejection from the client to the vendor, and that conversation can be completely held just with the vendor and the client. So if you ever see one of those, just let the vendor know to reach out to their client or have a call with the client and the vendor, and you can together figure that out. In the end, there are very few different ways an invoice can be rejected. Just keep that in mind, that those are the three options that you have. Once you find one, you're either determining that the out-of-the-box rule is a defect or not. Or if it's a custom rule, then the client needs to adjust that custom rule on their own with our services team or with a partner. And then finally, if it's a manual rejection, the invoice itself is being rejected for human reasons, and the vendor should be contacting their client.